Nathaniel Thornwell had drafted the correspondence in less than 10 minutes. In retrospect, the sheer brevity of the task should have served as a revelation to him. He had stripped the message of any lingering sentiment, keeping the prose as lean and rugged as the land he worked. The request was clinical: a rancher situated in the remote stretch of Callow Creek, 34 years of age, seeking a woman of competence who was prepared to labor by his side and maintain a humble residence. He offered no poetic descriptions of the rolling hills or the golden grays of the sun on the grass. He provided no insight into his own character or the lines etched into his face from years of solitude. Twice, he had inadvertently used the word quiet to describe his life, a repetition he didn't even catch before sealing the envelope. He posted it before the weight of what he was truly inviting into his life could settle in his mind. That had been 4 months prior. The response eventually arrived from a woman identified as Constance Hawthorne, hailing from a small, tucked-away settlement in eastern Tennessee. Her script was disciplined, the letters marching across the page with measured, even strokes. Her reply was as economical as his inquiry. She stated that she was capable, that she harbored no aversion to grueling work, and that she would arrive at the stage stop on the 3rd Tuesday of the month, provided the arrangement remained agreeable to him. There was no desperate warmth in her tone, no staged performance of feminine eagerness to please. He found himself admiring that lack of pretense. He convinced himself that her pragmatism was the sole reason he had signaled his consent. When that Tuesday finally dawned, Nathaniel rode into town devoid of any specific anticipation. He was a man of routine, and this felt like little more than a logistical transition. He hitched his horse to the rail outside the general store, swapped a few perfunctory words with the postmaster regarding the weather, and wandered toward the stagecoach stop. With his hat brim pulled low to shield his eyes and his hands shoved deep into his denim pockets, he waited. He wasn't plagued by nerves, he viewed the arrival as a man completing a necessary, practical errand. The stagecoach pulled in 11 minutes behind schedule, a delay he noted with a flicker of mild irritation. The first to disembark was an elderly gentleman clutching a battered traveling case, possessed by a persistent, rattling cough that sounded as though it had taken up permanent residence in his chest. Next came a harried young mother with 2 energetic children who bolted for the dirt the moment their feet hit the ground, outrunning her grasp before she could offer a word of caution. Nathaniel remained still, his gaze fixed on the carriage door. Then, Constance Hawthorne stepped down. For a heartbeat, Nathaniel stayed rooted to the spot. He wasn't entirely certain he continued to breathe. His first thought, one that arrived with a jarring sense of quiet alarm, was that she was not plain. He didn't quite know what to do with that information. She was tall for a woman, carrying herself with a practiced composure that suggested it had been forged in the fires of difficulty rather than born of ease. Her attire was dark and functional, the hem of her skirts grayed by the dust of a long journey. Her hair was swept back and pinned with the ruthless efficiency of someone who viewed vanity as a waste of daylight. Yet, it wasn't her appearance that caused him to hesitate. It was her gaze. She surveyed Callow Creek slowly, with a deliberate, calculating intensity, as if she were mentally mapping the exits and calculating the distance to the horizon before she had even fully committed her weight to the soil. She spotted him before he found his voice. "Mr. Thornwell," she said. It wasn't a question, it was a cold identification. "Miss Hawthorne," he managed to reply. She looked at him with the wary scrutiny of a person standing before a door they weren't entirely sure they should unlock. Without further ceremony, she hoisted her bag, a single, weathered leather satchel that she kept gripped tightly to her side, and gave a sharp, singular nod. "I am grateful for your coming to meet me," she said, her voice steady. "I have no intention of occupying more of your time than the work requires." Nathaniel struggled for a response, finding none, so he opted for silence. It felt like the wrong choice, yet it was the only one that didn't feel like a lie. The journey back to the ranch was defined by the rhythmic creak of the wagon and the vast silence of the plains. Nathaniel kept his eyes locked on the trail ahead. He was not a man easily swayed by distraction, yet he found it profoundly inconvenient that he was so acutely aware of the woman sitting beside him. To compensate, he ran through a mental checklist of chores: the leaning fence post in the south pasture, the long overdue supply order, the cluttered state of his kitchen which he had neglected to scrub. None of these tasks held his focus. Constance sat perfectly upright, watching the landscape roll by with the same haunting intensity she had displayed in town. Once, when the wagon wheels dipped sharply into a hidden rut and she was jolted in her seat, her first instinct was to check the leather bag at her feet before she even bothered to steady herself. Nathaniel saw it. He filed that observation away in a dark corner of his mind without meaning to. The ranch house was a modest affair, and Nathaniel was keenly aware of its shortcomings. It consisted of 2 rooms, a lean-to kitchen, and a porch that faced the west, a porch that caught the dying light of evening in a way that served as the property's only true luxury. He had never felt the need to apologize for his home to anyone. Yet, as they pulled up, he felt an uncharacteristic urge to say something, a desire he quickly suppressed. Constance stepped down and stood in the yard, her eyes traveling over the timber and the roofline for a long, silent interval. "It's solid," she remarked finally. "It is," he concurred. "That is the quality that matters most out here." He wasn't entirely sure if her assessment had been limited to the architecture. That first evening, she took over the kitchen without asking for a map of his cupboards. She moved with a quiet, investigative grace, locating utensils and ingredients as if she were reading a book she hadn't been granted permission to open, yet knew the plot of regardless. The meal she produced was excellent, better than anything Nathaniel had prepared for himself in a decade. He ate in silence. He felt that offering a compliment might inadvertently open a door to a conversation he wasn't yet prepared to navigate. After the meal, she methodically cleaned the plates while he sat on the porch, a book open in his lap as a shield. When she finished, she appeared in the doorway. She informed him she would occupy the smaller room and required very little in the way of accommodations. "That will be fine," he said. "Mr. Thornwell," she paused, her silhouette framed by the amber light of the lamp behind her. "My only aim here is to be of use. Truly. That is all I seek." He looked at her then. In the fading twilight, her features were a mask of stillness. But there was something shifting behind her eyes, something guarded, watchful, and deeply weary in a way that had nothing to do with the miles she had traveled. "I suspect you will be," he replied. She nodded once and retreated inside. Nathaniel remained on the porch long after the light in her window died out. The night was heavy with warmth and the persistent thrum of crickets. Somewhere in the distance, an owl gave a solitary cry before vanishing into the shadows. He thought of the bag she refused to let go of. He thought of the way she scouted for exits. And he thought of a woman who claimed her only desire was to be useful, a phrase that, in his experience, was exactly what a person said when their true ambition was to vanish. The first week drifted by with the careful, strained politeness that defines a new arrangement. Constance was always awake before him. He would enter the kitchen to find the scent of fresh coffee and a room that had been brought to order, evidence that she had been moving about for at least an hour. Yet, he never heard her. Nathaniel was a light sleeper, a habit born of years on the frontier, and the fact that she could move through a wooden house without a single floorboard groaning was a detail he noted with growing unease. She worked tirelessly. She mended a tear in the front room curtain that had bothered him since the spring thaw. She reorganized the pantry with a logic so immediate and profound that he felt a quiet surge of gratitude. She mastered the cadence of the ranch with a speed that would have been impressive if he hadn't been so preoccupied with his own suspicions. Suspicion was the word that kept surfacing in his thoughts. Not because of anything she had done, on the contrary, she had done everything perfectly. And that was the problem. In Nathaniel's world, people showed their flaws early on. A person who showed no rough edges after 7 days was either a saint or someone who was very carefully managing a facade. Nathaniel had seen enough of the world to know which was more likely. He watched her the way he watched a darkening horizon before a gale, not with cowardice, but with intense, focused attention. The facade cracked on the 8th day. Nathaniel had been out in the north pasture since before dawn, checking a line of fencing that the wind had been punishing all week. When he returned to the yard mid-morning, George Sutton, a weathered, quiet hand who worked for him 3 days a week, was standing by the barn. George was fidgeting with his hat, an uncharacteristic display of nerves. "Is everything all right?" Nathaniel asked before he had even dismounted. George nodded, though his expression remained troubled. A rider passed through. Pulled up at the gate asking questions. Nathaniel looped his reins around the hitching post. "What sort of questions, George?" "About the woman. Wanted to know if a lady had arrived here recently, what she looked like, where she came from." George turned his hat in his hands, his eyes fixed on the brim. I told him I didn't have the faintest idea what he was talking about. Nathaniel looked toward the house. Through the kitchen window, he could see Constance. She was moving with unhurried precision, as though it were a perfectly ordinary morning. "Did he give a name?" Nathaniel asked. "Said he was a cousin," George replied, his tone conveying exactly how much he believed that claim. "Searching for kin." Nathaniel thanked him and headed for the house. Inside, Constance was seated at the wooden table, shelling beans into a tin pot. She looked up as the screen door creaked, and he saw her read the gravity in his expression instantly. Her hand slowed, though it did not stop its work. "A rider stopped at the gate this morning," Nathaniel said bluntly. She didn't flinch. She didn't drop her gaze. She set the pot down with the agonizing care of someone determined not to let their hands betray a tremor. "What was his inquiry?" she asked. "He was looking for a woman," Nathaniel replied. The kitchen became vacuum-sealed in silence. "What response did you give him?" "I wasn't here. George sent him on his way." Nathaniel pulled out the heavy chair across from her and sat down. "Constance." She looked at him, her eyes hard. "I'm not going to force you to answer questions you aren't ready for," he said, his voice low. "But I need to know if there is a threat approaching this house that I need to be ready to meet." She remained silent for so long he began to doubt she would speak at all. "There is a man," she said at last. "He maintains a belief that he has a claim on my life." "He does not. But he is not the type of man who respects such distinctions." She picked up another bean pod. "I did not travel this far to bring a storm to your doorstep, Mr. Thornwell. That was never my intent." "Intentions don't always get a seat at the table," Nathaniel said. A flicker of something crossed her face, not quite the shadow of pain, nor the light of gratitude, but a complex middle ground. "No," she whispered. "They do not." Nathaniel let the weight of the moment settle. Outside, the wind rattled the eaves and the chickens clucked in the yard, the world continuing its indifferent rotation. "What is his name?" Nathaniel asked. She hesitated, the word clearly bitter in her mouth. "Aldrich. Harlan Aldrich." The name meant nothing to Nathaniel, but the way she spat it, with a flatness born of long-term endurance, told him everything he needed to know about the man. "Very well," he said. She looked up, surprised. "Very well? I heard what you told me." "I have no intention of casting you back out onto that road," he said, standing and tucking his chair back under the table. "But I need you to stop moving through this house like you're waiting for a warrant to be served. If trouble is coming, we'll stand a better chance if I know what its face looks like." He walked back out to the porch before she could find the words to respond. That evening, the air had cooled, and Constance joined him on the porch. She stood at the railing, her gaze fixed on the darkening silhouette of the hills. "I departed Tennessee under the cover of night," she began. She didn't look at him as she spoke. 2 years ago, my father brokered a match with Harlan Aldrich. I was never a part of that conversation. When I informed him I would not submit, my father told me I lacked the agency to refuse." She paused, her knuckles white against the wood. "I decided he was wrong." Nathaniel remained silent, giving her the space she needed to fill the air. "I replied to your advertisement because it was the most distant one I could find. I foolishly believed that 3 states of distance would be a sufficient shield." She turned to him then, her eyes searching his. "I should have disclosed this before I set foot here. It was a deception, and I am aware of that." Nathaniel studied her for a long beat. "Why did you keep it from me?" "Because I was terrified you wouldn't take me in," she said. The admission was raw, stripped of any decorative pride. Its honesty hit him with more force than he had expected. "I have a question for you," he said. She waited, her breath held. "That bag you carry. The one that hasn't left your side since you stepped off the stage." He held her gaze firmly. "What is inside it?" Constance stared at him for a long, unblinking moment. Then, without a word, she retreated into the house and returned with the leather satchel. She placed it on the porch railing between them but did not open it immediately. "Sit down, Mr. Thornwell," she said softly. "There is more to the story." He sat. She unbuckled the straps. Inside, tucked beneath a folded woolen shawl and a small, well-worn Bible, lay a legal document. She withdrew it with trembling fingers and laid it on the railing. In the dying embers of the sunset, Nathaniel could see it was a land deed. He leaned in to read the name inscribed upon it. Constance Elaine Hawthorne. "That land belonged to my mother," she explained. 40 acres in Greer County. She bypassed my father and left it directly to me in her will. He fought it in the courts for 2 years and he lost every time. That was when he realized the only way to seize what he couldn't inherit was to marry me off to a man who would take it for him." She tapped the paper. "Harlan Aldrich has been hunting this piece of parchment since before I even understood its worth." Nathaniel leaned back, the scattered pieces of the puzzle finally clicking into a cohesive picture. The clipped letters, the solitary bag, the eyes that scouted for exits. It wasn't coldness. It was the hypervigilance of a survivor. "Your father," Nathaniel said slowly. "Is he the sort of man who eventually relents?" "No," she said. "He is not." "And this Aldrich?" She folded the deed and tucked it back into the bag with practiced care. "Harlan Aldrich tracked a woman 300 miles after she told him no." "I believe that provides you with your answer." It did. Nathaniel stood and walked to the edge of the porch, looking out over the property he had spent 11 years building. He had placed every board of the house and barn with his own hands. He had buried a loyal horse on the south end and struggled with a stubborn garden on the north. He knew every groan the house made in a gale and every approach an intruder might take. He turned back to her. "I'm riding into town at first light to speak with the sheriff," he declared. "I want it recorded in his ledger that you are here as my intended wife. I want it known that any man who sets foot on this land uninvited will be dealt with as a trespasser and a threat to my family." Constance stared at him, her mouth slightly agape. "Your intended?" "We have a business arrangement," he said. "That is the story we tell the world. Unless, of course, you find that prospect objectionable." "You would do that?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. "After everything I just confessed?" "I told you I wasn't sending you back to that road," he said, meeting her eyes with a steady resolve. "I meant it the first time, and I mean it now." She looked at him with an expression he hadn't yet seen. The careful, ironclad composure she used as armor was gone. Something else was visible now, something raw, vulnerable, and profoundly real. "Mr. Thornwell," she said. "I truly do not know how to receive a kindness like that." "I don't need you to know how," he replied. I just need you to stand aside and let me do it. Harlan Aldrich arrived on a Friday, 3 weeks later. He rode through the front gate on a powerful gray stallion, flanked by 2 men who looked like they were paid for their silence and their aim. Aldrich possessed the easy, toxic confidence of a man who had never been told no by anyone with the power to back it up. He was broad in the shoulders and dressed in fine clothes that were far too expensive for the frontier, the mark of a man who valued appearance in a land that only valued utility. Nathaniel was waiting on the porch when they arrived. He didn't descend the stairs to meet them, he held the high ground. I am searching for a woman by the name of Constance Hawthorne, Aldrich said, his voice smooth and devoid of hurry. I have reliable information that she has taken refuge here. This is the Thornwell Ranch, Nathaniel stated, his voice like grinding stone. And the woman you're describing is my wife. The word wife hit the dusty yard like a lead weight. Aldrich's smug expression didn't vanish, but it tightened, the skin pulling taut around his eyes. Is that a fact? He challenged. Married 3 weeks ago. I have the documentation inside if you have a sudden urge to practice your reading, Nathaniel said, his hand resting casually but purposefully near his belt. Is there anything else I can assist you with? Aldrich stared at the house for a long, calculating minute. He looked back at Nathaniel, his eyes like those of a gambler realizing the deck had been swapped. Her father will want to be informed of this development, Aldrich said finally. Her father is more than welcome to send a letter, Nathaniel countered. Whether she chooses to respond is entirely her own concern. That is the way of things here. A heavy silence followed. One of Aldrich's men shifted uncomfortably in his saddle. The gray stallion tossed its head, annoyed by the flies. Well then, Aldrich said. Without another word, he yanked his horse around and rode back toward the gate. His shadows followed. Nathaniel watched the dust cloud until it settled and the road was once again empty. He stayed on the porch for a full minute after they vanished from sight, listening to the wind move through the parched grass. Then, the front door creaked open. Constance stepped out. She stood beside him, her gaze fixed on the horizon where the riders had disappeared. Is it finished? She asked. For today, he answered honestly. Men of that breed don't always quit. But they usually go looking for an easier mark. We just made this one a lot harder to hit. She nodded slowly. Nathaniel looked at her. She was still watching the road, her eyes still careful and vigilant. The habit of counting exits was still there, perhaps it was a part of her that would never truly fade. But beneath that layers of survival, there was something new. Something that looked remarkably like the beginning of rest. They did eventually marry. It wasn't for the sake of legal protection or to satisfy a lie. It happened on a crisp, quiet Thursday in early November. The sheriff served as their witness, and George Sutton stood by the barn door, his hat held respectfully over his chest, simply because no one had told him he had to leave, and it felt right that he should stay. Constance wore her dark, practical dress because it was the finest garment she owned. Nathaniel wore a clean shirt and, in his preoccupation, forgot to comb his hair. She reached up and straightened it with her hand before they walked inside to say the words. Neither of them ever felt the need to mention the gesture afterward. He presented her with a deed box, a sturdy, lockable chest of solid oak, to keep her mother's land documents safe. She kept it on a high shelf in their room, positioned where she could see it from the bed each night. The following spring, she set to work on a garden at the north end of the property. To Nathaniel's mock frustration, the soil cooperated with her immediately, producing a bounty that his own hands had never been able to coax from the earth. By their second summer, the house was no longer quiet. They had a son, a boy who inherited his father's stoic nature and his mother's watchful, intelligent eyes. He learned to walk by gripping the porch railing for dear life, falling 11 times before he simply decided that falling was no longer an acceptable outcome. Constance laughed when he finally found his balance, a real, unburdened laugh that came without warning and echoed across the yard. Nathaniel decided then and there that it was the finest sound the ranch had ever produced. He never found the words to tell her that. He didn't have to. She knew anyway.